Hey guys, welcome to the tiny house. Today we're going to be doing a practice where I incorporate some of the anatomical language of movement into the practice. Now, this is not the language that you would use when you're teaching a normal class, but this is the language that we need to understand as yoga teachers so that we can read scientific information and get more into movement science and let that inform the way that we teach as yoga teachers. A lot of times people find this to be a little bit dry to study, so since most yoga teachers are very movement-based and in touch with their body, kinesthetic learning usually works better. So that means moving and maybe saying the terms out loud as you do the movements, and that will really help the information to gel in your mind and become something that you can use on a regular basis. This is also the first practice that I'm doing with my lovely new Cork Yoga Mat. And this one I really like because of the lines on it to help with placement and to make sure that you're centered. And I think that's going to be a really nice thing for this anatomically based yoga practice. If you're interested in getting a Cork Yoga Mat, I'll leave a link in the description below with a coupon code that you can use. When we go into talking about the spine, what you're going to notice is when we're talking about the cervical spine, the neck, we're doing head movements, neck flexion and extension, and we think about kind of looking up and down, or for rotation, looking left and right. When we're working on the thoracic spine, from the kind of large prominent bump at the back of the neck to kind of the start of the lower back, the 12 thoracic vertebrae, we are usually talking about that in terms of how the arms are moving because those are so closely connected. The shoulder girdle, or sometimes it's called the pectoral girdle, is attached to the thoracic spine through a lot of muscles in the upper back. So what the arms do is going to have an impact on the thoracic spine. So we can look at that as thoracic spine flexion, kind of rounding through the upper back, dropping the head forward. The neck usually gets involved too, because those two are pretty close. And then thoracic spine extension, where I'm trying to lift my sternum up and squeeze the scapula back. That's one of the hardest places to create extension in the spine in the thoracic. And then to create rotation, we usually do that classic arms come up, swing yourself around. Now, the whole spine is connected, so I'm also getting rotation in the cervical spine, the thoracic spine, and a little bit in the lumbar spine. But I'm really focusing on trying to get as much rotation kind of around the shoulder area as I can, and not forcing it into the lower back because the lumbar doesn't love strong rotation. And then we come back to the middle. The arms go up through abduction, and then I swing around into spinal rotation to the left, and I'm just really focusing on that thoracic rotation because it's usually harder there. And then back up into the middle, abduction, palms come together, slide down into wrist extension there in that prayer shape. So then we have lateral flexion, that coronal plane movement, and sitting and sweeping the arm over is where I'm going to start to get that lateral flexion through the thoracic spine. And I'm really thinking about opening up through my rib cage on this side. So when I inhale, I'm trying to expand in here, and I'm also thinking about lifting the opposite side, kind of scrunching it and lifting it, because that's going to create a stronger opening on the opposite side. So even though I'm looking for movement in the thoracic spine, I can use some other body parts to assist with really focusing in on that movement. I'll switch to the other side. My shoulder's going up and over, and I'm externally rotating, getting that pinky drop, thumb up, kind of flared position with the hand, and then I rotate that all the way down through the arm, so it really happens here from the shoulder joint, from that glenohumeral joint, and the scapula is upwardly rotated. to give my shoulder that good healthy position with any overhead reaching. And then I take that big inhale into the thoracic cage on the right. And then as I exhale, I'm trying to scrunch a little bit more into my left side body. And then I'll come back up into neutral. And I can do a little bit of axial elongation of trying to lengthen the spine from end to end so that it kind of takes away the curve of the spine a little bit. Whenever we lengthen, those waves are going to get pulled apart slightly, and that's okay. Sometimes we just want some extra space in the spine. So now we're going to move down to the lumbar spine, and I'm going to go down onto the mat because just like thoracic spine movement is tied to the shoulder girdle, movement of the lumbar spine is tied to the pelvic girdle, because the way that the lumbar vertebrae transition into the sacrum, and the sacrum is part of that pelvic bowl, those two structures are going to impact each other pretty strongly. So the best way we can focus on lumbar spine movements is through movement of the legs and the pelvis. So I'll come down onto the mat. And first we'll start with that sagittal plane movement, the flexion and extension kind of plane. But in the pelvis and the lower back, we're going to use our posterior pelvic tilt to create lumbar flexion. And then I'm going to go into an anterior pelvic tilt. You see the very strong arch underneath my lower back. That's creating lumbar extension. So I go posterior pelvic tilt, creates lumbar flexion and a lot of effort in the abdominals. And then anterior pelvic tilt, I get extension in the lumbar spine. So then I'll go back into neutral there. And to get some lumbar lateral flexion, I can walk my feet over to one side. It's kind of a weird movement, but it's the opposite of what I just did with my arms. I'm going to walk my feet over, and actually that feels great. Getting a nice stretch down through the outside of my lower back and my hip. And I have that lateral tilt of my pelvis. And that lateral tilt of my pelvis is then going to impact the lumbar spine to also go into lateral flexion. And then I'll do the same thing and walk my feet over to the opposite side. I'm pushing my right sitting bone, my right ischial tuberosity away, and I'm pulling my left sitting bone up toward me so I get that lateral tilt of the pelvis. Nice coronal plane movement. And then I'll walk back into the center. Okay, so then that brings us to transverse plane movement, rotation, and I'm going to just drop my knees over to one side. It's going to lift up my pelvis here, and remember the pelvis and the lumbar spine are really strongly connected, so what one does, the other one follows, and then I'll rotate to the other side. Feels really nice. We don't get a ton of rotation in the lower body during the day, so a lot of times it's something that our body really craves to create balance. I'm also getting some nice gentle rotation through the hip sockets, through the actual hip joint. Okay, so those were the three movements of the lumbar spine, the three pure movements. And then we move into the pelvis. So we already kind of talked about the pelvis movements with that lumbar spine because they're so close. But I want to show that to you in a different way, because the hardest thing about really grasping the terminology of movement, the language of movement, is understanding it no matter which way the body is oriented, no matter what yoga pose we're in, of really understanding, well, what plane of movement is that and what movement is actually happening. And the way that we get good at that is practicing it in different orientations to gravity. So down on the back, we did some pelvis and lumbar spine movements, and now I'm going to do that in a kneeling position. So one of my favorite things too to really get a handle on what's happening in the pelvis is to hold on to it. Put your hands one on either side of the pelvis, and I'm going to tuck my tailbone and lift my pubic bone and see how my lower back, my lumbar spine flattens out into flexion. and that's my posterior pelvic tilt. I'm tipping the bowl backwards. And then anterior pelvic tilt, I'm emphasizing my lower back arch. I'm stretching out my abdominal muscles, and I'm kind of dropping my pubic bone, lifting my tailbone, lifting my sitting bones, and then I'll roll back to a posterior pelvic tilt. You'll see that in cat and cow, right? So in cat and cow, you're trying to emphasize that posterior pelvic tilt, lifting the low belly, tucking the tail, and then anterior pelvic tilt as you come up into cow. And that, of course, feels really good on the lower back, especially toward the end of the day if you've been standing for a while. So now let's look at rotation of the pelvis. And one of the things I like to play around with here is to actually just lift one knee straight up off the floor. And then if there was a ball sitting on my lower back, it would roll off to the right side as I lift my left knee. And then I'll do the same thing on the other side. Lift your right knee up. And then if there was a ball here, it would roll off to that side because of that rotated position. And then we're going to create a lateral tilt, or that movement on the coronal plane. So if I step back, So if I step back with the right foot and then really push into that heel, like I'm trying to lengthen that so that my side body opens, there's going to be a little bit of a lateral shift. And then I'll come back to center, send the other leg back, and really let my pelvis move with it. Sometimes we're stabilizing the pelvis. This is not one of those times. I actually want to let this open up so that I get that extra space down through the side, just like I did on the mat when I walked the feet over to the side, and then release that. So I'll show you that in one more angle. When I was facing the mat and I lift the knees up, I was getting some rotation in the pelvis, but if I do it this way, I lift my knee up off the mat using my hip muscles, and now I have this lateral drop of my pelvis, and then I'll do the same thing to the other side, lifting my left knee up, I get a right lateral drop of the pelvis. Okay, those are the three planes of movement in the pelvis: rotation, lateral, and then anterior posterior tilt. So now we get to go into the hip socket, and just like the shoulder, the hip socket is a ball and socket, but with the hip, the socket is typically deeper. There's a little bit of individual variation from one person to the next of the exact shape of the acetabulum, or the part that the femur head sits in. And that's going to impact how much rotation and how much hip movement you have. So always take into consideration individual variation of bone structure. It's one of the reasons that we don't force movements and we don't try to force our body into poses. It's more of exploring what movement is available at that joint for me, which is going to be different for you and everybody else who's doing a yoga practice. So for the hip joint, we're going to start with rotation, and I'll actually stand up for this one because this is the example that's on the PDF handout. So if I was just standing, feet facing forward, kind of like I'm in mountain pose, but then just turning my feet in, and I'm trying to get that rotation from up here. This is an internal rotation at the hip joint, just like with my arms if I rolled in, but that rotation has to go all the way up to the shoulder joint. Okay, then I'm going to go opposite way, turn my feet out like a ballet stance, whatever ballet stance that is, but the rotation's happening up here at the ball and socket joint of my hip, and it's kind of going all the way down the lower extremity. When we start to change into other positions, this is where it gets a little bit more complicated with hip rotation. And one of the common ones that we do, of course, is down on the mat. We do supine bound angle, or Supta Baddha Konasana. So I'll come down and just drop my knees out to the sides, feet together. So we have a very nice external rotation at the hip. And when we're doing this pose on the back, the line of gravity is pulling down. So as I relax, gravity is assisting to open up the knees and create stronger rotation. So it's a gravity-assisted, passive, external rotation at the hip. And then I can switch and go the opposite way for internal rotation. I love this position. I tent the knees together. I walk the feet out to the sides. This is such a nice way to open up around the back of the pelvis, around the hips. And this is the rotation that we do much less in yoga. So your body might not be really familiar with this sensation, so go into it slowly, but this is internal rotation for the hip. This is a great resting and restorative pose for the end of practice, where you just tent the knees together and let yourself rest here. Really let the hip joint kind of get used to doing internal rotation. We don't want this to be unfamiliar to the body. Okay, so one more example that I'm going to give you. Sometimes I'll do this in standing, but since we're down on the mat, I'll show you in this position. If I was doing this in standing, I would be standing on one leg and just holding a knee up like stork pose. But since we're down on the back, we're going to do both legs at the same time. As I open the knees out to the sides and bring the feet together, I get that external rotation, very similar to Supta Baddha Konasana. And then I come together, keep my knees together, and open my feet for a nice internal rotation of the hip joint. All right, so external rotation, open the knees, and then internal rotation, open the feet. In this variation, gravity is not really helping or making it harder, so it's kind of gravity neutral. But it's an active movement because I'm making that happen with my muscles internally. So that's a nice way to introduce some effort to the hip rotator muscles. And then sometimes I'll put a block here in between the knees to do that internal rotation, open and close while you're squeezing the block to activate the inner thigh, the adductors. Those are usually a little bit weak and need some attention. Okay, so that was hip rotation, but we kind of jumped ahead a little bit because I got excited about rotation, and we can't forget hip flexion. So classic Apanasana, we bring both knees back, and this is a strong flexion. So as I'm pulling back, you can see my tailbone lifts slightly, so I'm getting a posterior pelvic tilt with the pelvis. That brings me into a little bit of lumbar flexion. I'm in full hip extension, or I'm in full hip flexion, full knee flexion. So there's a whole lot of flexion going on there. And then I can drop my feet down onto the floor, and I'm going to start to push my feet down into the mat, and now I'm going toward hip extension. So I really have to lift up pretty high for that, to try to get my legs slightly behind my pelvis. And that would be my hip extension. I'll lower down, bring the feet up into the air. And if I open into a wide V like this, I'm going into hip abduction. And then I can come together and cross my legs like I was going into eagle pose. And that cross of the midline is bringing me into hip adduction, adding toward the center. And you can switch those back and forth. Hip abduction, come back together, cross the opposite way. Nice hip adduction. And open. Okay, so there's our 3 planes of movement at the hip. And then we come down to the knee. And the knee is primarily a hinge joint. For today's purposes, I'm just going to say the knee is a hinge joint. In the future, you might hear a little bit more detailed information, but for today, we're just doing flexion and extension. So here's full knee extension, very straight, and then I go down into full knee flexion. And these are great to play with in chair pose as well. So if I was standing, I would straighten my legs, and then I would come down toward a chair or a squat for lots of knee flexion. When we go into child's pose, and Apanasana is really just child's pose flipped over. If you took me and threw me over the other way, I would basically be in child's pose. That's a lot of knee flexion, but when we're over in child's pose, gravity is pushing my body weight down onto my knees, so it's a little bit more intense because gravity is really creating some pressure there. Sometimes that can be too intense for certain students. Okay, so then that brings us down to the ankles, and I'm going to come up into standing to show you the ankles, because just standing on the floor is probably the easiest way for us to really look at the specifics of what the ankles do. So starting out with a toe balance, which is something that I love to work on because it's so strengthening to the muscles that wrap around the ankle, the sides of the ankle, and the front and the back, the calf muscles, the muscles that come up the shin. So we're going to push the feet, the ball of the feet specifically, and the toes down into the mat to come up. And this is plantar flexion of the ankle. Remember, everything with the ankle is flexion, both ways. Plantar flexion is when you plant your foot down onto the floor and push into the floor. So think of those P's. Plant your foot, push into plantar flexion. And I also call it the Barbie foot, because if you've ever had a Barbie doll, their feet are kind of stuck like the high heel position. So that's plantar flexion. And then we go back the opposite way, which is sometimes more challenging to balance here, but this is dorsiflexion. Remember, if you had a dorsal fin, like a fish or a shark, on the top of your foot, you would be lifting the dorsal surface. So there's your dorsiflexion. Okay, now the slightly more confusing ones are the side-to-side movements of the ankles. And when we lift the big toe up, that is inversion, because I'm lifting the inner edge of my foot. If I flip the little toes up, the pinky toes up, that is eversion, because I'm lifting the outer edge of my foot. That's how I remember it. If we go into a pose like Warrior 2, and you look at my back foot, it's a little tricky to tell at first. Is it inversion or eversion? But what you want to do is take your mind and pull the body back toward anatomical position or mountain pose, and that's where you're going to see how it deviates from that standard position, and that will help you to figure out, oh, it's inversion. So I'm going to hop this foot back and kind of keep that ankle shape there. So it would be sort of like that. So it's inversion. My big toe would be lifted. It's closing that medial surface of my ankle and opening the lateral surface of my ankle. So we know that that ankle in Warrior 2 is an inversion. All right, so inversion, eversion, and sometimes it's fun to play around with that as a warm-up, especially before you do some balancing poses or some things that are really going to ask a lot of the muscles around the feet and the ankles. I'll just kind of roll in and out a few times, roll up onto the toes, roll back onto the heels, maybe turn that into a little bit of a circle. Really get some good circulation going through the feet, especially in the winter if it's cold, and especially in the morning. In the morning we have to work extra hard to prepare the body for what's coming because it's been dormant and cold throughout the night. So we're really going through that process of warming up. Okay. Last part are the toes. So the toes are going to do basically the same thing as the fingers. We have flexion where we bend the joints. We have extension where we straighten and lift. And then we have abduction to spread them out away from the center line. In the hand, the center line is the middle finger. In the foot, it is roughly the third toe. And then we're going to hug the toes in together. That's adduction, adding toward the center line. Abduction, take it away. Adduction, bring it back together. And then we can also work on flexion of the big toe. So I'm just going to push This is very tricky. I'm just going to push my big toes down into the mat as hard as I can. The rest of the toes are lifted into extension. Okay, and then I'm going to try to switch. Lifting just the big toes and pressing the other toes down into the mat. It's very fun mind to muscle connection to play around with the feet, because you have to be so focused, and at first it kind of feels like my brain isn't talking to that part of the body, but the more you do it over and over, you will create a stronger neurological connection, and then it will be easier, just like every other movement that we practiced in yoga, right? The first time you did a warrior two pose, you were like, where do my arms and my legs go? What do I do? After a few years of practice, it just happens. The body knows what to do. So you can see how doing poses over and over creates that stronger connection of your mind to your body. And now we have a whole nother language to go with that. So we can be very specific when we are talking about a joint, whether it's in flexion or extension, if we're doing internal rotation and abduction. All of those things are now in your language to talk about how the body is moving. Thank you so much for being here and studying with me. If you would like more information about the body, please check out my courses on Udemy, Foundations in Anatomy and Body Science Part 1, 2, and 3. And then I'm going to be coming out with a comprehensive yoga anatomy course that's going to have 30 hours of content. And within those 30 hours, it's going to cover all of the basic anatomy, physiology, and body systems that I teach to my 200-hour yoga students. So if you want to understand the body better and have a very good, solid understanding of how yoga and the body interact with each other, that course would be perfect for you. Thank you so much for being here.